spaces that educated those particular groups of people were not doing it because of a great school system. They were doing it in spite of it, right? So I think for policymakers to now rethink the concept of disinvestment, right? So now when we see what has been removed from schools, we can see what rationales have been placed on particular bodies and neighborhoods, right? So this is spatial, this is racial, this is gender. And then because in school spaces, and I got this from a school board member, the issue is never about budget. It's where the resources are allocated, right? So we look at where resources are allocated, and you see these specialty magnet programs, or Chicago, we have in cost selected enrollment schools. We see this redistribution of resources that continue to trend up, right? To students who are already high performing students. Those students who have been at the lower rungs, now they get even less, right? And that plays into this desperation that's being placed on families through charters, parent triggers, school choice, right? So I think reframing around understanding disinvestment and reallocation is something that policymakers need to take into their lexicon, because that's something you rarely see that folks do in their policy analysis.
As a quick follow-up, vouchers seem to really illuminate this idea of disinvestment, because it's perhaps of all these policies in some ways the most visible, just on an individual level, taking opportunities, scholarships, and giving them to students and in search of a better education. What would you, I mean, either of you, what would you say to folks who are really sort of the mind that this is a good and sound way to achieve equality and some of those ideals of integration? How would you begin to unpack that?
I think the first thing I would say is, all right, I mean, like, and I've had this conversation with groups of parents.
Yeah.
And just saying, like, let's think about this very practically. Are you willing to engage in a system that, if you have, the first thing I do is I ask, how many folks have multiple children, right? And then when they raise their hand, so whoever has multiple children, are you willing to engage a system where only one of those children, quote unquote, have access to this program that probably won't do anything for them, right? Are you prepared for that? Right? Are you prepared to say one of your sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandkids will get this, others won't? And the money that they're using from your taxes is now being taken from that general public surplus to fund schools and put in this that your kids already won't have access to, right? I mean, just talk about it that frankly, because a lot of times, again, because folks are so desperate for a viable educational experience, you're grasping at anything. So now when people put this shiny thing in front of you, it's very enticing. So now we have to deconstruct that and say, everybody's not going to have access to that. And are you willing to do that in your own family? Right? Not just thinking about it writ large, but literally, if you have multiple children, you are now signing up to a system that guarantees this group of them won't have access to it, because there's no provision for families with multiple children in a lot of these voucher programs. So I mean, I think that and it's been my experience that parents have seen this and said, oh, damn, that doesn't come to the equation, right? Because they think about it as having this broad scope of access, and that's not necessarily the case.
I think, again, I kind of stay probably too high up in the stratosphere in terms of thinking about some of these questions, because I still wonder what we want our schools to do. What do we want them to accomplish? And who do we want them to really serve? Because I don't know that question has really been answered. I mean, I think there is a certain group of students that do very well. There's public schools and systems that work very well for certain children. But really kind of asking ourselves the question, do we really expect that for every student, every school, every community? So that's one piece. The other piece I wanted to go back in getting the evidence into the hands of policymakers. I think that's a huge challenge that the academy still continues to try to grapple with, and I'm concerned it's becoming even more challenging in the fake news kind of space that we're in, where nobody really trusts information or evidence. If I'm a policymaker and I have a mandate from my constituents to be very extreme or to hold a series of positions, there's really no evidence or research that's going to change my mind, right? So we're seeing that even now politically, even around non-policy issues, that just what are the things that are going to get me reelected, and what are the things that my very now extreme base as a result of gerrymandering and other things requires me to do. So I don't know what the answer to that is in terms of trying to build those relationships across research, practice, and policy communities, but I think it's critically important. And I think that we can be strategic as researchers in building that community and working with, for example, nonprofit organizations, agencies, youth groups, and policymakers who have those shared objectives and agendas, and building, again, this kind of collaborative, collective relationship where we're able to support each other through that work. And so by working with practitioners, people on the ground, policymakers, we're generating and asking the right questions as researchers, and that policymakers, and there are many policymakers who want to engage in the work that we're describing in terms of educational transformation and providing opportunity for all students who need the information. They're just busy kind of doing all of the other things that they're expected to do. So how do we build that network? Which again, historically, when you look at Black educators, always existed even before they had technology. So you had, the Colored Teachers Associations that were prohibited from joining NEA and the other unions because they were Black, but still somehow through newsletters and communication, as Vanessa Stovall's work highlight, was able to engage in these shared practices, right? Kind of like what you described with even the gas masks, right? Like how do we share that information and continue to recognize and know that we're working towards the same goal, even though that goal is not necessarily embraced by the institutions or structures that we're working with.
And I think that piece, and what it goes back, because I don't think it's necessarily a high order question in terms of that first positioning right there. What do we want a school to do, right? I mean, like that because the thing is, we get so caught up into this concept of a good school, right? We never really, what is it, right? We never really talk about a good school, and there's been community organizations that say, okay, here's what's in a good school, right? A good school doesn't dehumanize poor students of color, right? A good school has a highly qualified, supported teacher. A good school makes sure that teachers are supported the most in years 1 through 3, because that's the year that they leave, right? We know a good school says, all right, if it's a K-8 school, we want to also pay attention to their transition into high school. If it's a high school, we want to pay attention to their transition into whatever they go into post-graduation. So these things around that community folks have done, but now saying, what is it, before we even started, it's like, what is this good school? And then, I learned from these community organizers, they were like, look, and this is to Sonya's point, every effort to claim human dignity in Black and brown life at the neighborhood level is thwarted and met with extreme violence, right? So this thing around how do you now start to think about that in terms of the work that you do, and it's in our grandmother's wisdom, right? Because it's too much like right? It's too right, right? To happen, right? That's what you're supposed to do. No, right? Because it's too much like right for the wrong group of people, right? So this thing around now, thinking about it in different ways.
So we both talked a lot about transforming structures. So we're doing two radical reconstruction. We're really transforming structures. So there's, again, keeping in mind this idea of thinking as in ways and how we would talk to folks to engage in policymaking, both actual policymakers, but all the advocacy people as well. So there's a lot of folks who see a lot of opportunity in a couple of new elements of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the call for evidence and indicators on social emotional learning, and the call for evidence and indicators on what they're calling school discipline, but
Mhm.
in climate.
Mhm.
So, given kind of what you've shared with us in terms of really being aware of the racial caste system, of trauma, of thinking from a conditions kind of lens, what guidelines would you give to folks who are really in the weeds of developing those policies, at the state and local level? They're collecting data, they're deciding what those indicators are. If this is an opportunity for us to do some transformation structures, if it is, then what would you like to see?
I would like to see, and I think it's something that I was kind of hoping to see before ESSA, but I think ESSA does provide some space for it. Again, this is more for the current administration. But community capacity building. And so really thinking about how communities build power. And I don't know that we talk about power in that deep when we talk about transformation.
Yeah.
But you need power in order to reach that. And so I actually just wrote a special issue, actually, in the Journal of School Leadership on ESSA. And former student and colleague Carrie Sampson and I wrote an article called Putting the Public Back in Public Education. And I think it's just, again, focusing on public accountability, recognizing that education is a public good, but many people are trying to kind of turn it into a private good for their own use, which is problematic. But really reclaiming kind of that democratic ideal, because I don't know if we've actually actualized it yet, but that ideal, and mobilizing young people, the people who have really been ahead of every movement that we've had, connecting with millennials as well. I'm always really discouraged by a lot of the discourse around millennials. People so frustrated, don't understand how they think and why they do what they do. But I think there needs to be more intergenerational understanding dialogue as well, to think about what schools have been, what we want them to be, if we want them at all.
Right.
So building that capacity among young people at the community level, and I think it's interesting how the right in many ways with parent trigger and some of the policies they use are so good at co-opting the ideas and practices of those who really focus on community and democracy. And so we just need to do a better job of articulating that. My partner was in politics for a while, and he shares kind of his experience even as a state level policymaker and all of the very sophisticated lobbying materials becoming constant outreach that he was getting for corporate reformers. Even with me at home telling them no, it's not a bad idea, it was just constant, and it makes sense. So it's, in terms of choice, you should have choice, you should be able to go and send their children to school they want. And so how do we who advocate for what is kind of the messier process of democracy articulate that in ways that people understand value? Because I don't know that there's a clear enough articulation of our values in terms of what we expect from schools that could very well resonate with the students and communities that we want to support. And so I don't know, I think that's part of what we need to do better at.
And I think this thing around really, you said, inputting a public construct back in education is really this thing around, because we have to ask some historical and actually, when we ask those historical questions, right, we look at the financialization of schools, right, in terms of now, Bree Pickhour found this thing on MSNBC about 3 years ago. And they're talking about now schools, charter schools in particular, with what they call projected value-weighted income, right? And value-weighted dollars isn't necessarily real money, but this is a projection on what type of money this will bring forward if it is approved as an industry, right? So they're talking about charter schools internationally as $1 trillion industry in the next 30 years, right? So you look at that and you say the largesse of this, right? And Black radical feminists often talk about, this is the onset of late stage capitalism, right? Where everything becomes financialized to the point where everything has these prescriptive values on it. So I think back to your question around, I think we have to revisit, this thing around reform, right, has been financialized and corporatized, right? So now, corporate folks frame themselves as reformers, right? That's what Uncommon Schools, the white dude in Atlanta, Joe, what's his last name is Clark, right? And then I'm forgetting the branch, the corporate charter network you all have here in DC, but not Kids, another one.
Base.
Right, Base, thank you, right? And this, and then Kid, right? So this work hard, it's called right, work hard, be nice. What the fuck, that? It's like, come on, people. I mean, because because it calls for people to really call out what's happening to folks, right? Because when charter schools purport their success, the question that is always missing is how many folks got kicked out of the process, right? This is always you all have heard this stuff in Chicago about a school, network of schools we have called Urban Prep, right? All black males, their thing on, so if you saw a bus or a billboard, 100% of our students get into college, right? It's like, all right, if you started with 267 and you graduate 160, what happened? Right? I mean, so this thing around now asking these larger questions, and then folks around really kind of pushing it. And this is a thing, right? A lot of people fear unpopularity, but it's always this thing around people don't really revisit the history of King. King was extremely unpopular. He was extremely unpopular, right? In terms of, because they thought about him as a troublemaker, right? So I can only think So I can only think about like Black Power, right? In terms of Black freedom struggle, what they represented, right? Because J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to national security in the history of the United States, right? So this thing around how we even frame, I think this reframing around saying, like, look, this reform thing and getting in front of the corporate folks and saying, look, you all are not reformers. You all have just reinvented a new way to dehumanize folks. Right? And financialize it, right? The valuation number, these valuation numbers are heavy, right? Because what it really plays into is tricking people on the stock market, right? It's the psychology of the idea of growth, right?
So real estate, and that's another big part of it now, buying up land for real estate.
And this thing around really being able to get in front of that and say and to your point, Priya, I think this is another thing. When we start to frame our arguments around who has been historically disenfranchised, right? So what of the people at the bottom rung, not your high performing student, what about folks who have been historically disinvested? Right? What is it? Because that now you push back against a politic of disposability, right? Because that group of folks, in all of these lenses that we've mentioned, that group of folks is being disposable, right? If you think about here in DC, that little corner of Southeast, that little corner left of Southeast, it's like, then it'll weed. Exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. So this whole thing to where the mayor San Juan had to say, look, we just being reminded on who's a colony. Right? In every instance, right? That is the colonial project. Right? You have been disinvested, you got a grid. They tried to hire a company to fix the grid with 2 employees.
You know what I'm
saying? It was like, damn, 45 Cheeto. And it was from the town that the Secretary of the Interior was from. And even in Puerto Rico, they were like, nah, we're good on that. We whitefish, y'all stay in whitefish, right? But that thing around how to even, I think the reframing of this now starts to get, because it's not about competing rhetoric, right? But it's really around saying, all right, what's happening here, right? And how are we now starting to say this, not around how to do it, but really around what's happening to folks who have been historically enslaved.
Let's do 2 questions from the audience. Who would like to ask something? Trish?
I'm a student in the education transformation program. And in both of what you both said, and talking about, especially like, I always worry when I hear that under-resourced schools, under-resourced neighborhoods are taking on the AP challenge, and look at all these kids, to me, you just financialize rigor, right? And so one of the questions that keeps coming up for me since this program started and before is I didn't have the right words and the right framework, and now I've got the framework. I know, critical race theory, I know culture sustaining pedagogy, and I question, where is the space for those new types of, because I truly believe that school has very little to do with education, and that it often is doing more harm to kids than if they just, were not there. And so if the space for those new buildings and those new spaces for education are not going to come through reform that is financialized, which I agree it shouldn't, there still is need for reform. And I feel like that the anti-choice, anti-parent lever conversation, which is rampant. I'm actually from Wisconsin, where we don't have those kind of charter schools. We actually have teacher-led schools where they are doing innovative things and doing kind of what you're talking about. So there are other models out there, but there are people in this room who either personally or their kids have benefited from reform. And whether it's coming from a charter school that's from a charter management company or from a teacher-led school, there has to be some space for that reform to happen. If we want that different space, where do you see that happening?
I think there's still a space. I was a big, it's funny, I have to think back about when I started doctoral studies at TFA, which I might have probably joined it, in terms of what I wanted to do and how I kind of thought I could play a role in transforming education, the ideas that I had at the time, which were not fully formed. And so I think there should be that space. I mean, if you think about, again, the origins of charter schools, it was to create that space. But the problem is, just in this capitalist structure, everything gets turned into something for profit. And I don't know yet what the answer is to prevent that. So I think, and I have a lot of students that ask that question, oh, why don't we just have some black run charter schools, Are there ways to just use that structure to create the type of schools that we believe would be effective, kind of like with the different indicators you described. But it's, again, this larger structure where, and Kevin Lawrence has written about this in New Orleans, a lot of Black educators did attempt to open charter schools there, but they were denied from the existing power structure, right? So I think there's a sense of a large part of it. I still do think that education, again, as an educator, is key. I also think that there are some amazing school leaders, principals, and superintendents. I just left a meeting earlier this morning with a community practice for school superintendents who've been doing some really impressive things in their district. So I think we also need to kind of recognize and highlight the people who are doing the difficult work and learn more from them. And so part of this project that I'm working on with my brother Ryan back there is learning more about these communities of practice and learning more about their stories to better understand how we can prepare those of us who want to do this work to do it more effectively. So I know that's not a kind of specific, I guess, action, but I think these are really knotty problems, and we have to, not knotty and then easy, but knotty in terms of difficult, and thinking about how we bring the best minds together, representing a diversity of perspectives to figure out how we can kind of recreate new sites and possibilities.
And this other thing around releasing the logic of scale good, I think that's a huge problem, right? So if something works well in one site, financialization says, and neoliberalism says, okay, get this thing and map it on to everything. And that's, so like when people do equity, I don't understand, like, look, the principal concept of equity is people need what they need when they need. To map on this different type, to map on the same thing for different groups of people is guaranteed to fail, right? And this is always the thing around when you have quote unquote reform efforts. Like you go to a school and then they say, man, it's really working well here. Let's do it everywhere. Like Bill Ayers always talks about this example of these legislators go to visit a kindergarten teacher. Hilarious story, right? They go visit a kindergarten teacher who's done all this amazing work with kindergartens, and she has a rocking chair and a carpet. Right? I think you know the story, right? New York, the state of New York, in any preschool still has this rule from the 70s because of one teacher's class that you have to have a rocking chair and a carpet. And you're like, did we miss the point here? Right? I mean, but this thing around, but just think about that ruling, right? I mean, because that's the absurdity of it, right? So I think about two schools, particularly in Milwaukee, right? There's a school called Transitions that just became used to be a school for young folks who were kicked out of school. And it was doing so well that it actually became a school, right? And then another school called Alliance, which is a school that actually concentrates on the efforts of LGBTQAI young folks, right? So they performance indicators are high, what have you. But trying to map that onto other folks just isn't going to work, right? And this thing around the original vision, what Sonya was talking about, charter schools, the original vision of charters, and we often never get this conversation. When Al Shanker and AFT were talking about charters, they were originally intended for teachers to study their own practice, right? And that vision gets totally eviscerated. I was just in Portland, and they had an agate school. But the construction was like this highly resourced school. They got water fountains, and every class got a sink. I was like, damn, right? But then they have these windows in it. So think about a classroom that also has these observation windows, right? So that the teachers just come through and just look at what's happening in the classroom. I just got a window to do it in. I'm saying to myself, what space does that, how is that actually going to improve instruction, right? So this thing around really thinking about, and I take from Mike Dumas, right? Hell with thinking outside the box. Fuck boxes. All this is wrong, right? We're saying, look, now we have to look at what those administrators, teacher folks have done to say, we're so disconcerted about school, right? The thing is, what are we doing for the young folks in those spaces, given what we know of their histories and their capacities to change the condition, right? Now, it's a contradiction. And I'm the last person to be purporting anything John do, right? But Dewey makes a point that we miss. Schools, because of their connection to government, in and of their nature, are conservative, right? They're framed in that way, right? And if we look at Noah Webster, Noah Webster said this thing right up the street, and we forget about this. Noah Webster said, true democracy is total anarchy. And because it is, we need a school to curtail that anarchistic tendency. Like, that's the dictionary, dude. Right? So this thing around so now schools are structured in that way, right? So when I'm talking about school abolition, so I'm thinking, so does education take us to another place, right? And that space, so how do we collectivize the efforts of folks who are concerned about educating, right? And what can we, to Sonya's point, what can we learn from them, right? And not under this guise of a reform, but to say, what is it that because remember, the idea of reform is that the thing isn't necessarily bad, right? And what we're saying is there's fundamental historical problems with this thing, right? So now what are we willing to do to put something new to the table, right? And not under the guise, we can corporatize this and get really slick with the language, right? We can call it innovation, right? This school's called innovations, right? It's innovations charter, all this madness, but really saying, okay, what? And I think this gets back to the question: what are we getting here? Like, there was a quick story. There's a charter network in Chicago called Chicago International Charter School, CICS. And I was talking to a person from there, and she broke down this story that week out. So we met, and she said, if you have any education operators, let me know. I was like, who's an education operator, right? Yeah, exactly. When she talked about this, so an education operator was a principal, right? So, and what it was, so CICS is broken into it's a conglomerate. It's broken into 4 groupings who now license from CICS. And I'm saying to myself, wait, so this is like McDonald's franchise.
In New York, they're gonna allow charter members to license their own teachers.
Yeah. So yeah, Blue Jesus Project, the whole joint, and they relay the whole piece, right? So this thing, so I'm saying to myself, wait, you all have corporatized this to the point of licensure, right? To the point where they're literally these 4 groupings are licensing out from CICS the curriculum, discipline policies, and now in oversight, all they're doing is making recommendations on those spaces, right? And CICS, ironically, was one of the first charter management organizations in the city of Chicago, right? So I'm looking at this, and I'm at the coffee shop freaking out, like, she just explained to me the McDonaldization of teaching, right? Just in real time, right? So, and people would reference that as an innovation, right? And I'm saying, for whom, right? And that process is probably going to guarantee those who have historically had the least to have even less, right? So I think it's really around us asking that question in real time, right? In terms of what's happening.
Krista, do you have a question?
No, just a lot of kudos. So if there are any other questions in the space. Okay, so actually in one of our classes this week, we read an article by Robin D'Angelo about white fragility. And I think that's something that's very pertinent to what we both were talking about today, because a lot of people would be, like you mentioned, like when they come and be made, very comfortable and stuff. And so how, as equity-oriented researchers, practitioners, and everything, do we prepare ourselves to kind of deal with that and recognize that that is kind of the system we're up against and the forces that we're giving you that.
Yeah, it's a super quick quote. Gloria Lasson-Billings always says this. When you expect, she says in classes, Gloria works in University of Wisconsin. She always makes this joke. She says, "I work in Wisconsin. Those are original white people." So she was like, those are original white people. So like Nordic, the umlauts, all that. She was like, I work with original white people. So she says, when you get into spaces with folks and you get this sense, and Robin D'Angelo, I was just on a conference call with her, right? She talks about this thing where when you get in spaces like that, you can be preemptive, right? You can say, well, look, as a space where we want to challenge the current conditions, I know this is going to bring up a lot to you all, for folks who haven't heard this. At any given moment, I want you to be able to take care of yourself when you get hit with the reality that you're facing, right? And to some people, that will sound super colorful. But what it does allow for, it doesn't allow for the violence of white fragility to impact the space that you're in. See, we never think about white tears as violence, right? Because that white tears now takes the honest away from what it is that we're talking about, right? So now when you say, when you say that to folks, so if you as the body that you present, when you say that, folks is like, oh shit, right? Because they may expect that from me, right? But when you say, I need you to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, right? And they go, ooh, right? But this thing around, and Gloria Lasson-Billings would do this, so when somebody would get into the tears, oh my God, I just can't believe it's so bad. Like, do you need a minute? Right? And she's just clear about that. And if you do, the ask is you vacate the space so you can take care of whatever you need to take care of. Right? And that thing around, because a lot of times people think that that's a space of non-caring, but actually is a a different space. So that, because what it is to that person who's demonstrating that at that moment, what you're saying is, now you know. Right? So now, with you knowing, you cannot impose that on folks, because the folks that are in this class have had that imposed on them since they've been here. Right? So now that thing around and just saying that explicitly will change it up, and trust, they will come, as my mom says, they will come to your class the next trip tightened up. Right? they will know when they come with you, it's not a game, we are not playing that game. So whatever you need to do, take care of that. You know, we are cool with that. But the issue is, I want you to take care of that, because in so many spaces, those bodies who have been excluded do not have that space. Right? So now you can't fill that with that type of, because that's a form of psychic violence. Right? Because now all the catering goes to the person who's crying or freaking out. It's like, whatever you need. And girl, as Billy says, it's super French, and come back when you feel you're all right. Right? And that's me, I'm just like, because for me, I'm always, because I'm waiting for we thought that was mean. And just, look, you want to understand meanness, you really want to understand what psychic violence is, look, read Fanon, and then put that in terms of white kids, and then have them watch some YouTube by a young person named Jill is Black. She has this thing on white tears and white fragility that is the best. And at the end of it, she has a cup that has white tears, and she drinks from it. And I was like, and I just love that she just called herself Jill is Black.
I didn't hear that though, because I don't know that was some good advice in terms of Lisa, thank you.
What about from our guests? Folks who are around, yeah, please, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Elena. I am a PhD student in the economics program, and my dissertation is on segregation in public schools in the U.S. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what makes like an integration reform, not that there's not many of them, but what makes that successful? What gives you integration as opposed to dismissing bodies? Are there any specific things that will produce one instead of the other when you have a racially desegregated school? It will promote peers interacting as peers as opposed to just mixing bodies.
I mean, I think you have to have people who really, again, see the human value in everyone who's in the space. So one of the pieces that I wrote last year was called Social Justice for the Advantage, and it was part of a special issue that looked at Milliken versus Bradley. Right, was the decision that said you cannot have these metropolitan desegregation plans, because in Detroit, for example, the city district was primarily all Black, and then your suburban or county districts were white. And so the only way you could engage in any type of desegregation, let alone integration, was by doing that across districts. But the piece just kind of talks about this tension that I described as the tension between white freedom and Black equality. And to me, it's just, that's where things just kind of fall apart, whether or not it's trying to close achievement gaps or integrating schools. Because there's this notion that the privilege, and I use the Black and white as kind of this, dichotomy. Obviously it includes not just Black and white people, but for those who are advantaged, right? And this notion that I should have the freedom to choose who I associate with and who I don't. That always comes into conflict with the desire for Black equality in terms of having access to spaces and resources, right? And I think what we don't talk enough about in the desegregation or integration discourse is all of the white resistance that has supported desegregation plans over the years. So it's great to try to develop policies to advocate for desegregation, but again, historically, we ignore the white nationalist movements that have cropped up in local communities since the 60s and 70s in response to busing and desegregation. And they've happened all across the country. So again, I think the narrative that we have around integration has been very limited in not pointing to and making central the decision of white people in terms of not wanting to participate, in terms of engaging in white flight, in terms of in Prince Edward County closing down the entire public school system and turning it to a private system so that you And those in power have to see that power, and I don't see that happening.
And just a real quick piece. The space where it's been done the best has been the space where it's been done by accident. Right? This American Life has a really interesting piece around the Charlotte-Mecklenburg district. Yeah. And I think it's just this real thing around putting the concept to so it's like conceptually, right? It's not really about the students who have been excluded, right? It is about, because that's round two. Round two is the interpretation. And we never talk about round two, right? Because round two is the interpretation that the proximity of students of color to white people will improve educational attainment, right? And that was the interpretation, but it was never wholesale, right? So we have the Little Rock who? 9. How many people went to Little Rock Central High School? Right? So it wasn't 700 to 700, right? It was 9 to 1,500, right? So this thing around the premise never operates well. And then Derek Bell's pieces, Gospel Choirs and Ethical Ambitions, he talks about the assumption of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in their desegregation strategy throughout the South was that desegregation was the pathway to quality education. And folks in those communities were saying, that is not what we want, right? And even the Brown decision was not about proximity to white people, right? The Brown decision was about viable educational options because the Brown family lived across the street from a high school they couldn't attend, right? So this thing around how do we now start to think about it, and Charles Ogletree does a good job of this in a book called All Deliberate Speed, yeah, in terms of like framing this out. Now, I don't know your advisor, so once you start to talk about as an economics person trying to talk about the rationales of deseg, but I think this becomes important because that thing, you really don't get a sense of it. This is kind of what Sonya's saying, like you don't get a sense of this in a real way in terms, because all it's been interpreted as legal policy compliance, right? It's just been this legal, and because it's been constructed as legal policy compliance, all it is the shipping device, right? And you see this actually in higher ed too, right? So Harvard has gone crazy now over the last 2 months. We are over 50% people of color, but you still are over 75% legacy, right? You just changed the bias, right? The concept and the structure is still the same, right? So this thing around really thinking about it, and it's so funny, they claim that we're over 50% people of color, and the data was like 50.7%. Harvard, y'all tripping. But this thing around how to really frame it, because that thing, true integration, I would argue, is still very much an idea, right? You don't see that in a district. You may see that in a school, but you don't see that at the district level, right? And if you do, it's by accident. Like that's why this American Life story was so important, because those district-wide efforts, I mean, this goes back to the Jenkins. If you look at the Jenkins case, you're talking about the most malfeasant case in terms of the distribution of resources. I mean, because the white suburban districts gave to the city, they're now, and think about this, if you were in a school, you're in a neighborhood that the school that's in your neighborhood, the white kids from the existing suburbs go to, that's right across the street from you, that you can't go to because they contribute dollars to the tax levy. I mean, it is nonsensical, right, in terms of how they try to enforce it. And, we never hear about Jenkins. We don't hear about the vestiges of Milliken. I mean, like all these cases that
I don't think most people know about the fix decision.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or Seattle or North Carolina. I mean, all of these things that come through that we is still very much an ideal. I don't know if we see that in terms of on the ground, district level.
Yeah, last one. Okay, I'm in the education and
So be
transfer.
quick.
Okay, theory to practice. So a lot of this is super conceptual, and most of us are gonna be like are trying to be on the ground, policymakers, teachers, that kind of stuff. Where do you start moving this into practice? What's like the first thing, if you could, you would do?
In terms of school level or classroom or?
I don't know, like, do you start in a classroom? Like,
Well, it's different things, right? Like if you're talking about, you just mentioned policy on the ground, policymakers are on the ground, right? But you're asking, what can I think about if I'm gonna be a teacher?
yeah,
That's
personally,
very different
yeah.
from, right? What can I think about if I'm gonna be constructing policy? So if you're talking about in a classroom,
Well, I guess personally, I'm talking about in a classroom,
Uh-huh.
but
that's all right.
It is.
So,
It's all good. What is thing around, what has been, I mean, and this is kind of the space, so like I teach classes, one of my former undergraduate students. So the thing that I'm always asking is, who is affected, and how am I resisting and interrupting the vestiges of white supremacy, and how am I capitulating to them? Right? I ask that is a curricular question, right? That's a curricular question, that's a pedagogical question, right? So am I contributing to this, or I'm willfully working to interrupt this to pose something different? And if I am, how am I posing something different? And whose work do I now incorporate to actually do this thing differently? Right? So I mean, I think because that's a question of, so if you're in a schoolhouse and asking you to comply with whatever state standards, what have you. So now it's the thing about, okay, what are we starting? So I'm not going to start with the state standard, right? I'm not going to start with the new generation science standard. I'm not going to start with whatever the state nationalization is. I'm not going to start with the Common Core. I'm going to actually start with, what am I trying to communicate? What skills am I trying to build with my students? Now, once I build that out, it's going to automatically map onto standards because the standards are now, right? So starting out in that space, like what is, so we know hella much about the wrongs, right? But who are the people? And that's a little bit of digging. So that's where, as a teacher, you have to get your organizing space, your organizing hat on in terms of who knows what they're doing, right? In that building, and then out in the world in terms of thinking about these radical imaginaries and ways in which to approach classrooms, right? So it's really, you are always in fact-finding mode about your practice, right? You're always asking questions about your own practice, right? You're doing that in perpetuity, right? So in my own stuff, some days shit does not go well, right? So you have to say, okay, well, in reflection, what will I do to improve? And then no savior concept, right? No white lady coming into the room saying, okay, little black and brown babies, here's a book. No, none of that shit, right? That cannot exist. But what we have to do is also say, all right, what community of practitioners am I working with who are now supporting me and challenging me on my work? And sometimes, depending on the condition, you might be building that out, right? You might have to start the work of building those capacities out in your locale. You might find that in some of the conferences where people are now starting to do different work. But this thing around your practice is the mechanism of resistance, interruption, and then radical imaginaries, right? But this thing around thinking about it in those spaces, as opposed to making sure that you meet the standards. That's the least of the words in terms of when you actually start to think about your work from these radical imaginaries.
I think in equipping yourself with tools, all of these organizations that were in Dr. Stovall's paper are examples, and I think there's even more. But when you start to look at different organizations that have really unpacked, history curriculum, social justice curriculum across different grade levels and content areas, it becomes sort of a way for you to build your sort of curricular and pedagogical kind of arsenal to really think about how you're transforming your practice. I mean, I know I looked at a couple of these and just got a lot of ideas for meetings for different kind of projects, so. These lists would be a good place to start.
And I think just asking yourself the question, like, why am I here? Why do I want to be in this classroom? What do I have to contribute to these students? I have my students do sociocultural autobiographies as part of like their own personal reflection. And, oftentimes students write about the second grade teacher who said something nasty to them, or the principal who is the only reason that they decided to become an educator. So I remind them that, these things stay with us, and the extent to which you will be in someone else's autobiography in 25 years, what will they say about you? And so part of me, I'm just really kind of in a space where reflection and being so intentional about the work that we're doing is really important. And I think when we do that, then the other answers come.
Thank you, guests, for joining. Our next part of this series will be in the spring term, so we hope you'll come back and bring folks with you. And yeah, folks are here in case you want to have some quick follow-up. We're going to take a short break and then move on to our next kind of portion of the afternoon with the educational transformation